Good evening and welcome to the New York Public Library. I'm Jason Bauman, Associate Director for Collection Development and Coordinator of the library's LGBTQ initiative. And welcome to the launch of Mark Gevisser's new book, The Pink Line, Journeys in the World's Queer Frontiers. Mark is joining us from his hometown and his home in Cape Town, South Africa. His book is a global exploration of how conversations around sexual orientation and gender identity have come to divide and define the world in entirely new ways in the 21st century. And he's joined for this conversation by Andrew Solomon, National Book Award-winning writer, activist, and lecturer on politics, culture, and psychology. You can find Mark and Andrew's full bios in the event listing on the library's website. New York Public Library is an ideal place to host this conversation because we have one of the greatest collections of LGBTQ history in the United States, having the archives of pivotal organizations such as the Managing Society of New York and ACT UP New York, of individual activists like Barbara Giddings and Joseph Beam, and of key cultural figures and writers and artists from Virginia Woolf to James Baldwin. Please remember, this event is being recorded, not you, but only the event itself. That is to say, myself, Andrew, and Mark. Mark will take some of your questions at the end. You can send them at any time during the conversation by typing your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom app. We'll make sure they get to Mark and Andrew. They'll answer as many as they can. At the end of tonight's conversation, we'll be sharing a short two-question survey with you, and we'd love your feedback if you have a second. We'll post the link to it toward the end of the event, wherever you're watching, in the chat on Zoom and in the comments section on YouTube. In the weeks ahead, we'll be featuring programs with Isabel Wilkerson, Edward Ball, Saida Hartman, and many more. If you'd like to learn more about these events and everything else that the library is up to, please visit NYPL.org/connect, where you can sign up for our newsletter and access the myriad of resources we are making available at this time. And now please welcome Mark Gevisser and Andrew Solomon. Thanks.
There we are. Mark, what a pleasure to see you from so far afield. I hope all is well in Cape Town. I'm thrilled to be the one who gets the opportunity to talk to you about this remarkable book, which I read in manuscript. Mark and I were undergraduates together and have known each other for, I guess, 3.5 decades or so. I've enjoyed Mark's previous books, but I will say for all of you who have joined us this evening, this one is an achievement of a completely new scale. The extent of the research, the internationalism of it, the depth of the thinking, the insight into the international scene is nothing short of extraordinary. And I am not aware of there being any other book that treads this territory with the same authority and clarity and charm. The book is eminently readable. It's extremely engaging. It's full of stories, and it really sketches out a new way of thinking about LGBTQ, etc. identity as it exists, and makes powerful arguments that while many of us have benefited from the extraordinary liberalism that has been introduced into the lives of people who are LGBTQ, that there are many other people for whom the developments have gone in the exact opposite direction. So Mark, as an opener, why don't you tell us what you mean by the words, the pink line, and how you define it?
Andrew, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to New York Public Library for hosting this. I have to say, before I answer your question, what a pleasure it is being here with you. When I was pitching this book to various publishers and funders many years ago, Far From the Tree was without question the most important reference. It was always, my book's gonna be Far From the Tree meets something or other. I can't remember what the something or other was, but Far From the Tree always was there. Because of the scale of Far From the Tree's ambition, the scope of its ambition, but also because of the very particular way you work empathetically with the people you write about. It's been something of a lodestar for me. So I'm thrilled to be here with you. You know, as Jason said in the introduction, I was increasingly aware, as we all were in the 21st century, of a new global conversation about a new human rights frontier, which has become known as LGBTQ plus rights. And I was fascinated at how things were being discussed and contended in ways certainly unimaginable to you and me when we were undergraduates 3 decades ago, and even more unimaginable to people in other parts of the world, in India, in West Africa, in Russia. The notion of a pink line came to me. I remember the very moment. It was in 2013, and I was struck by the way that almost within weeks of the United Kingdom passing a same-sex marriage act, Nigeria passed an anti-same-sex marriage act, even though no Nigerian queer person was even asking for marriage. What Nigerians were asking for was, basic rights to security and dignity. And what was fascinating to me was the way that this pink line was being drawn geopolitically, as in a sort of new global culture wars to otherize people on the other side of it. So in a place like the United Kingdom or Western Europe, countries with long traditions, long liberal human rights traditions, with women's movements that preceded gay movements, this was sort of moving to the next level of universal human rights. But at the same time, people in those countries were sort of staking a new line along complex old borders, old frontiers, sort of defining what is civilized and what is barbaric. And barbaric was on the other side of that line in Nigeria or in Russia. Meanwhile, on the other side of that pink line, you had political leaders, patriarchs, priests, presidents, Vladimir Putin, Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, who were staking their own pink line against what they called neocolonialism, against sort of decadent secular capitalism that they believed was threatening their cultural sovereignty, their traditional values. Really what they were doing, I argue in the book, was trying to set up barriers against globalization, against this a new wave of ideas that were carried by the flows of globalization, by mass movement, by the digital revolution more than anything, to be able to try and protect something kind of national and against this threat of a global sort of onslaught. In the middle of these warriors on either sides of this pink line, or on the pink line itself, are LGBTQ people, queer people who came to assume much more politically than their actual selves, fetishized as symbols of modernity by some, damned as stigmata of decadence by others. And that was the notion of the pink line that I sort of came up with and then expand on through the book.
Right. And so tell me, as you set out to write the book, how did you decide where to go? How did you find the people you wanted to write about in the countries that you visited? And how did you build your relationship with people to get to a point of such tremendous trust so that you really were able to chronicle the details of their lives, and the details of their lives in most instances over quite an extended period of time?
Yeah, I suppose I should say at the outset that the book is divided in two sections. So there's sort of these very deep personal profiles of people or communities or families that are interleaved with more analytical discursive chapters. And I was helped a lot in my research by getting an Open Society Fellowship. So George Soros paid in no small part for this book, which automatically makes me a warrior along the pink line myself because of what George Soros and the Open Society Foundation is accused of in countries like Russia or Hungary. And then it was really about, once I had something of a budget, it was about trying to understand where the pink line was being drawn in ways that would help illuminate it. So choosing places where there was contention, like Russia. It was obvious I was going to go to Russia, like Uganda and East Africa. but also places where there were pink lines, perhaps drawn in other ways. So I knew I wanted to be in South or Southeast Asia because of the age-old gender identity categories that have been there, like hijras in India or bakla in the Philippines. And I wanted to understand how a pink line might be being drawn between these cultural definitions and new sort of political or biomedical understandings of transgender rights that might have originated in the West. So India became another country. Mexico was a country that I was really interested in because of the way same-sex marriage was being contended there, and the importance of family in Mexican society. Israel, Palestine, because I was fascinated in the way a pink line was being sort of etched onto the green line that divides the occupied territories of Palestine from Israel. The way Israelis were making such a big play of being pro-LGBT rights to sort of to pinkwash, as their critics said, their human rights record against Palestinians, and to say, look, we're an oasis of democracy in this bad Middle Eastern territory. I wanted to understand what that might mean for Palestinian queer people. So I went to Israel, Palestine. And I came to the United States, a place that I know well. I studied there, but I'm not American. And I came to the United States really to understand how the culture wars had shifted over a decade from marriage equality and homosexuality, which is now, very much the new normal in the United States. There might have even been a gay first couple in the White House. How it had shifted to transgender rights, which has become the new sort of hot button culture wars issue, and how the pink line in the United States was running through sort of school locker rooms and bathrooms as Americans were contending over whether children could use the facilities congruent with their gender identities. So I found an issue, and once I'd found an issue in each place, I tried to find people who could illuminate the issue. And it was always working first with activists. And then activists would introduce me to people who had struggles of one sort or another. And I would get to know those people in one or two visits to each of the 10 places I focus on, and then would carry on a relationship with them online over the course of 7 or 8 years. Quite deliberately, this book took a long time because I wanted to see how they grew, how their stories developed, how their experiences developed, how they impacted on pink line politics and how pink line politics impacted on them.
Right. Well, you've touched on the sort of next 7 questions that I had made notes.
Sorry.
But why don't we look at some of them? I was very interested in the story from Guadalajara of the lesbian mothers, because I think so much of what has happened in the United States has been contingent on the proliferation of gay families. Obama, when he was speaking about the importance of making a shift and making a change, didn't talk about everyone's right to whatever form of sexuality they wanted. He talked about the children in his daughter's class whose parents were being treated with unfair prejudice. And so this question of having families, I think, has been more central to the American debate than has always been revealed. You didn't talk about that so much in your writings about the US, but you spoke about it quite movingly and very, very cogently in the section on Guadalajara. So tell me what you saw there and how much it resembles what you've seen elsewhere as you've gone around.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. And a historian who I really respect so much, Martin Duberman, recently published a book called "Has the Gay Movement Failed?" And one of his arguments from a sort of progressive left perspective was that because queer folk have sort of buttoned down, had children, joined the army, moved to the suburbs, and we've raised families, we've sort of thrown out all these radical values that defined our movement in a previous generation. And my feeling is yes, but I hear what he's saying. I agree with a lot of it, but I do believe that people like yourself who have raised families have become sort of cutting edge revolutionaries. Frankly, you with your children have much more interface with the big wide world than I do with our children. you have to deal with schools, you have to deal with clinics, you have to deal with other parents. And I think that does create a certain cutting edge for the understanding and acceptance of alternative sexualities and gender identities. So I was fascinated about Mexico because, partly because of the influence of the United States, obviously. There's such a close connection between the countries, but partly because same-sex marriage had become a huge issue there, had come to define the Mexican LGBTQ movement. And I chose a couple, Zaira and Marta, because using a very arcane Mexican constitutional mechanism, they had decided to challenge their home state, Jalisco, of which Guadalajara is the capital, to marry them, because they did not have the right to be married, and without the right to be married, they couldn't both be on the birth certificate of their daughter Sabina. So they went through this extraordinary legal process to get the right to marriage. And they chose to do it in Guadalajara rather than just going to Mexico City, which they could have done, because same-sex marriage is legal in Mexico City and it applies all over the country. They wanted to do it at home for activist reasons, because they felt they needed to shift the law and the culture in the place that they came from, in the place that they lived. They succeeded. They had a very poignant, very beautiful wedding with protesters outside. But they didn't succeed in getting both of their names onto the birth certificate. And that was very difficult to watch that happen in real time, because I've been following them over many years. The law just would not go that far for them. And once more, they could have gone to Mexico to do it, but they had differing opinions about this. And the difficulty over trying to make a family cohere with the law kind of tore them apart. And at the time that you read the book, they are no longer together, even though they're both still wonderful parents. And Sabina still has two mothers, even though they're not together. It was fascinating for me to compare as well family culture in Mexico with the United States, and I give some data that really struck me, which is that a very small percentage of people who identify as gay or lesbian or transgender in the United States have children, whereas a very large percentage of people who identify such, according to the last Mexican census, which was I think 2011, do have children. And it says something about the very different ways that you can be gay in the world, and that there's not one way, and that for people like you and me, Andrew, we might think of it as a step of liberation to have our children once we come out, whereas it might be a kind of normality in other parts of the world to be queer and to have children, maybe because you're queer on the down low, or because you lead a complicated life that includes a lover and a wife or whatever.
Interestingly, even in the United States, the state, according to the Williams Institute at UCLA, which amasses these statistics, the state in the US in which the largest proportion of openly gay people are bringing up children is Mississippi. The last thing that one would ordinarily have anticipated.
I saw that, yeah.
Yeah. You spoke a few minutes ago about pinkwashing in Israel. And you also talk in the book about the intersection of gay pride and money. And you have that description of all the companies that have ended up trying to exploit the gay market, the sort of wobbling cubes of rainbow colored Jell-O and so on and so forth that were part of that whole process. So what do you think the politics are of societies that are choosing either to lionize or indeed to stigmatize their queer populations? What are the ways in which the activities of these governments end up winning people votes? I mean, we've just seen in Poland that horrifying campaign that was almost entirely predicated, so far as one could tell, on an anti-queer platform supported by the Catholic Church. What are the ways in which some countries manage to get ahead that way, and some countries manage to really change the lives of their populations for personal gain, either at the corporate or at the political level?
I think, if one's understanding this global shift or this global staking, this global contention as a consequence of the vectors of globalization. I mentioned the digital revolution, which is very important. I mentioned the way people move. Human rights policy is obviously one too, and particularly during the Obama years, and Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton did a huge amount to promote LGBTQ equality worldwide. It had an effect. It has a counter effect too, because it's seen as a form of neocolonialism. So, for example, when David Cameron said that he was going to make aid conditional on LGBTQ rights, it had an incredibly negative effect, because it was the former colonial master telling African and Caribbean countries, what their mores should be. But there are also important positive effects by that kind of foreign policy approach. The kind of space that queer people have, thanks to the Goethe Institute or the American Embassy in difficult countries, is very important. So I've spoken about global foreign policy, but let's also talk about another vector of globalization, which is global commodity capitalism. And this is complicated because, those companies that are promoting LGBT rights are not necessarily doing it because they are committed to a better world. They're trying to sell product back home. And when Starbucks has a global reputation for being LGBTQ friendly, it's because of a market back home, and particularly in the Pacific Northwest, where a lot of its people are employed. But that has an effect. So the Starbucks in Malaysia, in the capital of Malaysia, was boycotted at one point because it was seen to be pro-gay. And fascinating, a whole bunch of young Malaysians started flocking to the Starbucks because they kind of liked the way it was connected to being pro-gay. And it was a way of saying, we're part of the world. We don't hold by these old traditionalist retrograde values. We're here, take notice of us. We're part of the global village. I saw that amazingly in the way at Bangalore Pride in South India, these phalanxes of corporate representatives of companies like Google and Hewlett Packard marching in gay pride. Interestingly, very few, if not any, gay or lesbian people marching themselves, because it was too awkward for them to be out. But it was not awkward to be an ally. It was a way of saying we're part of this global village. But that has its limits, because it really does have to do with the bottom line. So an example I cite in the book is an IKEA ad, a really wonderful IKEA ad that featured a lovely young British lesbian couple making their home in a tiny loft somewhere in southwest England. And IKEA chose to withdraw that ad from their Russian catalog because they were worried not only that it would draw the ire of the Russian authorities, seen as gay propaganda, which is illegal in Russia, but that it might also turn off conservative Russian consumers. I'm not sure how that answers your question, but the point is that there are these many different vectors which are creating these debates in new ways all over the world.
Well, it points to Russia, and it points, I think, to the ways in which Putin in particular has exploited the resistance to recognition of gay relationships as part of the way that he's continued to hold on to power, even at times when his policies have been unpopular or his initiatives elsewhere have been unsuccessful. I lived, as you know, but perhaps people at home don't, but I lived in Russia at one point. My first book was about a group of Soviet artists and the way their lives changed during Glasnost. I had at the time a Russian boyfriend or partner who was the drummer in the leading underground rock band at the Soviet Union. We would walk down the street in what was then Leningrad, and people would sort of faint at his feet the minute they saw him. And nonetheless, he was living with his parents, and we had to have our romance sort of sequestered on a train that we took back and forth between Leningrad and Moscow most nights. And then everything changed, and there was this sort of glorious moment of freedom, and it looked like it was okay to be gay in Russia, and there were clubs and there were all kinds of things, and he was very involved in them, and I went and hung out there, and it felt like this was a glorious new liberalism. And in some ways, I think precisely because of the repression that had preceded it, it felt more explosively joyful than gay life in the United States or in other societies in which it was accepted, the UK, where I also lived for some time. But you then talk about Russia, and your story about Russia is really, or your stories about Russia are really very heartbreaking and sad and devastating. I mean, particularly the story of the trans woman who lost all contact with her own child. So talk a little bit about the way that you see Russia and Putin in this large international arena. It feels some of the time as though once more there is a domain under Russian influence and a domain under Anglo-American European influence, and they are in opposition as they were during the Cold War.
It's wonderful that you told the story of you and your boyfriend and that opening up, because that's really the beginning of how Putin has used the gay issue. So that time that was such an opening up and so exhilarating in so many ways was also, as you know, catastrophic for Russia economically, right? People really struggled and really suffered. So liberalism, Yeltsin-style liberalism, is associated with rampant capitalism and with homosexuals. Well, it wasn't until Putin came along and thought, how do I define myself as the guy who's going to sort of bring Russia back from the brink? How am I going to show that I'm going to implement law and order, control, reason, in a way that just kind of went wild in the intermediate years between the collapse of the Soviet Union and me taking power? And how am I going to use that as a way of kind of bolstering my burgeoning autocracy? It was just such a perfect storm to be able to use LGBT rights in that way, because of the way they were being promoted by the West against which he wanted to define himself. Also because of the way in Russia and in so many countries, the attack on queer people is an attack on the civic space. So in Russia, I mean, even today, I mean, there was this wonderful piece in I think The Guardian, where sort of tracking where all the Grindr geolocations were in Moscow at a certain point, and a whole lot of them were in the Kremlin, Grindr being the gay hookup app. And you know, gay life in Moscow or St. Petersburg or any number of provincial Russian cities is on one level like fantastic. There's clubs, there's bars, there's hookups, there's all of that sort of stuff. But don't take to the streets and demand your rights, because that's not what we do in Russia. We don't exercise political rights in that way. And it so happened that at the same time that Putin and his lieutenants were looking for a way of drawing a pink line, queer Russians, as part of a global community, were claiming their right to be on the street. And this was immensely threatening. And it was another reason why Putin clamped down in the way he did on queer Russians. The Anti-Gay Propaganda Act also kind of legislation also sort of fits into a Russian war against depopulation, and this idea that Russians must procreate because Russian society is dying, and the homosexual became a symbol of a kind of decadent, non-procreative citizen, also an enemy from within, which has always been very much of a part of the sort of political construction of identity in Russia, as in the United States, to have an enemy from within that you need to fear because he or she or they are being corrupted by forces outside. I mean, the homosexual is perfect for that in Russia today as it was in the United States during the Lavender Menace of the 1950s.
Yes, you write very nicely about McCarthyism and about the way that it was used really to portray gay people, I think you said, as vulnerable and therefore dangerous, and make that very vivid connection. You write a lot about people who define themselves as queer, LGBTQ plus, any of these sort of larger categories. You write about a number of people who are clearly defining themselves as gay or as lesbian, and you also write about people who are really transgender. And I feel like one of the great questions in the United States even, or in Western Europe, as we look at the movement for equality, is whether trans rights are an extension of gay rights, and whether the movement for gay rights automatically applies to trans people. The whole question in the United States of passing an Employment Non-Discrimination Act that excluded trans people, sort of roiled the activist community for many years. Did you feel as you did this work that you could say gay rights are separate from trans rights? Did you feel like there was a sort of spectrum? Did you feel like it was all part of a single battle for queer identity? Where did you place that? And talk particularly perhaps about your experience in India.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. It's a big complex question. I mean, LGBTQ plus, that alphabet soup, is awkward and a pain because it keeps on sort of expanding. But it serves a really important purpose, because it reminds us that these identities are all different and have very different issues. Trans people have very, very different issues to cisgender gay men like you and me. But they're together in that basket in many respects because they're put in that basket by the pink line warriors on the other side. Yes. And you know what's fascinating about, you mentioned the transgender woman in Russia. I'll talk about Russia for a minute before speaking about India and the United States. So there's nothing in the anti-gay propaganda legislation that says that transgender, that mentions transgenderism, actually. But a judge used that anti-gay propaganda legislation to prevent the woman I write about, Pasha Kaptanovska, from having any access to her son. And so it really doesn't, it's not, one of the things that this book is doing is trying to understand how people look at themselves within the context of how they are seen. And in that respect, sexual orientation and gender identity fuse. There's been a long and really important movement in the West, and particularly in North America, to separate out gay rights from trans rights for I think, obvious reasons that don't need to be elucidated. That separation out is in many ways a Western construct. And one of the things that's fascinating about working in places like India or the Philippines or West Africa is to see how sexual orientation and gender identity do really work together in terms of the construction of identity, how they're interdependent in many ways, and to track the way a global Western originated rights movement somewhat disrupts that. So in Southeast Asia and in South Asia, they've long been these third gender categories since the beginning of time, hijras and bakla, as I said, and they're understood to be third gender, and they are very visible and very present. There are hundreds of thousands of hijras in India. Anybody who's visited India has seen hijras. They're not necessarily accepted in Indian society. They have their place, and it's a pretty abject place. And it's an abject place that has to do with being somewhere in the sort of muddy middle between male and female. Now, along comes the transgender rights movement, that says you don't need to accept this abject place in the muddy middle. Transition, be a woman, use your rights. If you have the resources, use biomedicine to transition to femininity and to live your life as a woman. So you don't need to just be a beggar or a sex worker. You can be whatever women can be in society, which, you know, we can discuss is not as much as what men can be. And that creates a lot of possibility and opportunity, but it also closes down space for people who are non-binary, or it means that people who are non-binary or somewhere in the middle have to reconstitute themselves, or rethink of themselves, or fit themselves into this paradigm of a transgender binary identity that has kind of been downloaded through these forces of globalization. And in India, I tell the story of an amazing community of people who call themselves kotis, women's hearts in men's bodies, who live in a small fishing village near Pondicherry, and who have made the decision, because of some access they have to human rights culture, that they're not going to take one of the two options that would be available to them traditionally, which is to accept to live their femininity as hijras, or to totally repress their femininity and wear pant shirt, as Indians say, grow moustaches, get married, have children. They are determined to be themselves, women's hearts and men's bodies, somewhere outside of that binary. And the way they do it is through devotional work in a temple that very conveniently requires you to worship the deity in saris. So this gives them the space in their village to have some sort of status. And I end my book with that story. I find them quite extraordinary, watching how they've grown and how successful their project has been. Not so successful, it turns out. It's very complicated, difficult terrain.
I think one of the things that's most striking is one reads the stories that are in the book, which, as I say, unfold sort of novelistically. And by the way, I should mention that Mark's book, and indeed my book, are available for sale in the public library shop, and I believe you can click through to get at them. Do get Mark's book. But one of the things that's striking is the enormous courage that's shown by the people you spoke to, pretty much all of them. Some demonstrated enormous courage in the simple act of speaking to you, and many demonstrated enormous courage in deciding that they were going to have and live these identities and be authentic to who they knew or understood them to be. We're going to go to questions in just a minute, but I wanted to ask how you position this book in the current moment. We're living in the Donald Trump presidency in the United States. We're living in a time of homophobia. We're also living in a moment when the focus on rights and liberties is largely occupied by the Black Lives Matter movement after the atrocities that generated this most recent wave of activism. How do you connect what you've written with what's happening today?
I think there are two things that come to mind. I hope I have time to talk about both of them. The first has to do with the pandemic and lockdown and isolation, and the way that what so many of us have experienced in the last 5 months, positively and negatively, is the lot of queer people the world over, kind of stuck in a Russian provincial town. Really not able to be yourself on the street, but having this fantastic online community you can connect to, just like we're doing here on this New York Public Library site, and that kind of dissonance between some sort of online liberation and the strictures of offline life, and the dissonance that comes with having to toggle between the two is something that I think queer people the world over are very familiar with. And we need to say about that too, that if this pandemic has accelerated the way we communicate through technology, it's not all good. At the same time as as queer people can connect and find some sort of online community or freedom online, they're also vulnerable to strategies like catfishing, which is this terrible way of entrapping queer people from the United States to Africa by offering them sanctuary and then extorting them or torturing them. The Syrian government, the Egyptian government, entrap gay men using Grindr and other hookup apps. But nonetheless, there is something about the relationship between offline isolation and online community that I think we've all experienced. That's part of the sort of 21st century queer condition. In terms of the movement for Black Lives, I've been really struck following it from a distance, from a country where we also have terrible police violence against citizens, and where we don't have the kind of protests you have. I wish we did. It says something about the way Americans value life. I wish we could more here in South Africa. But I've been really struck by the way the gay rights movement, the world over, begins with saying to police, state agents, law officials at Stonewall, on Red Square, on Tahrir Square, stop violating us, protect us. That is the sort of number one threat to queer people the world over are law enforcers who are using them to demonstrate to others that the law is being enforced. And there's therefore, I think, a really powerful resonance in the protests that have shaken the United States. For those of us outside of the United States, and who know who have experience of how the law violates queer bodies,
Right.
or agents of the law violate queer bodies,
Yes.
if not the law itself.
Over and over again. I remember in our undergraduate days, your camping outside of Commons, the sort of dining hall, to protest apartheid at a time when it was so easy as an American not even to be aware of what apartheid was, much less to set up a tent village and protest against it. So I know that you've been not only a chronicler of these changes, but also an agent of them. That's been
my relationship to the divestment movement was a little bit more complex than you remember, but I like that. I like the way you remember it.
I'll go on remembering it that way. Well, I think it's now time to open up for questions. So I am inviting questions in. I hope any of you who have questions have been putting them through on chat, and I will try to cover as many of them as I can. Here's our first one. Given all of the connections made between LGBTQ plus activism and Western imperialism, neocolonialism, what can we do, strategy, to help LGBTQ positive plus people in places where they are in danger without actually exacerbating the problem? That's a sort of central issue in your book, really, the question of what kinds of activism are helpful coming from abroad and what kinds of activism are damaging. How would you respond to that?
You know, it's complex, because the very first thing I would say is listen and follow the lead of people on the ground. And that's easier said than done, because different people will be saying different things. You know, some people on the ground might be saying, withdraw aid, lobby your congressman to withdraw aid. Other people on the ground might be saying, well, you know, if you do that, we're going to be victimized, because we're going to be seen as the ones who are causing the economic decline because aid has been withdrawn because of us. So it's very hard to listen when you might be given contradictory messages. But to listen carefully and to trust people who've made it their business to listen carefully, And I think always something that I've tried to do is respect the agency of people on the ground, rather than seeing them as some kind, them or their opponents, as some kind of articulation of your ideals. So I think it is absolutely true that the script for the kind of public homophobia that you see in so much of sub-Saharan Africa was written in the United States by the moral majority, by evangelical Christians, who saw how effective it was in gathering political power in the United States. And once they were losing that political power, we're looking for other fields to sow. That is absolutely true. But to speak about homophobia as a Western export sort of denies the agency of Africans who are homophobic. Just as to speak about homosexuality as a Western export denies the agency of Africans who are homosexual. It's not. I'm so sorry. This isn't a clear, easy answer for you. But it's an answer about mindsets and about what mindset one should go into understanding other parts of the world is. There's a kind of discourse around saving Ugandans or Russians by helping them get to the United States or to Canada. Now, 3 of my stories are stories of flight, and I didn't set out for that to be the case. It so happened that the people I was following left or had to leave, and all 3 of the people one is in Amsterdam, one is in Canada, and one is in Cape Town, and life isn't as easy as they thought it would be. The West is not necessarily a solution.
Yes, well, you describe how Auntie, even in Cape Town, having fled from Malawi, is exposed to terrible homophobia and is kind of called out in the streets and so on and so forth. I think it's a real question. We as a family took in a Libyan gay refugee 4 years ago who's lived with us ever since. And he sort of had in many ways a kind of ideal set of circumstances. He's done very well here. He was just admitted to Columbia University to do pre-med work. He wants to be a doctor and so on and so forth. I feel like often the complexity of the transition from one society to another is erased by his relative flexibility and adaptability, but that it lingers sort of deep down, even for people who aren't being called out on the streets or who aren't experiencing economic deprivation and so on.
Having said what I've said, the concept of refuge is just so important. It's such an important part of the American ethos, and it's devastating the way it's been trampled upon by Donald Trump. And I do hope that the United States continues to offer refuge,
or
without saving,
returns,
without feeling that it's saving.
Yes. Somebody asks, could you talk a little about the pink line on top of the green line in Palestine and Israel, and speak a little more about your perspective as a South African, how it shapes your view on the global gay rights movement?
Oh, there's a lot there. There's a whole chapter on the pink line and the green line, but really it's about understanding. It's about understanding the way the Israeli state has created a pink line to define itself as a symbol of modernity and democracy, as opposed to homophobic Palestinians on the other side of the green line. And the effect of that is that Palestinian society, in many respects, has come to associate homosexuality with Zionist nationalism. And the effect of that on queer Palestinians, whether they are in the occupied territories or in what is called Israel is very difficult to deal with. And I write about a couple, a really wonderful couple who live in Tel Aviv, Fadi and Nadav. And Fadi is the Palestinian. And what's really interesting is to look at the way Fadi deals with seeing himself celebrated for being gay and yet degraded for being Palestinian, and how he manages that very difficult dualism. You know, I come from a very divided country, and as Andrew noted, I've been in all my journalism. I'm a journalist, and book writing has been about South Africa and the divides of South Africa before. So I think I'm very live to borders and frontiers and lines, pink or green or otherwise. The fact that South Africa is seen globally as one of the sort of lights of human rights, particularly when it comes to LGBTQ rights. You know, we were the 5th country in the world to legalize same-sex marriage. In 1996, we became the first country in the world to explicitly outlaw discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. The fact that we have this extraordinary legal dispensation, and yet there is so much homophobic and transphobic violence on the streets, particularly when it comes to gender nonconformity, says something to me about how pink lines don't only run between countries, but through countries too, through communities, through families. I have a very sharp sense from being South African and living in South Africa about the sort of dance between legal reform and social change.
We have another question. 7 years is a significant amount of time to spend on one project. How did the project evolve over time? Were you surprised by any final components of the book, things you might not have anticipated when you first embarked on this?
Thank you. That's a very beautiful question. I mean, I wanted to watch time move. And, you know, I was watching people's lives change, and their lives often took turns that were very unexpected. And I end the book with a meditation on, you know, that American campaign, It Gets Better, which was very powerful, but also quite strongly critiqued for, you know, ads that celebrities gave, public service ads like Ellen DeGeneres, to young queer people saying, if your life is tough, don't worry, it gets better. It will pass. You will go through this. And it was, I think, very valuable to many young people. And I've seen iterations of it in other parts of the world that have been very valuable too. And for all of the people I followed, I so wanted it to get better. I wish I'd had one story with a sort of textbook, soft focus, happy ending. And I don't, because life isn't like that. And the people I write about live in difficult places and in difficult times. Yeah, I'm not sure how well that answers the question, but I've been constantly surprised. I suppose the other thing that's about the people. Thematically, what's been really surprising and interesting to me is the way the dial has shifted from the L and the G and the B across to the T, and how the new global contentions are around transgender rights, and specifically around this new boogeyman, sort of invented by the Catholic Church, but now embraced by all manner of people on the religious right, of gender ideology. So gender ideology is the new evil. And I find that fascinating, that it's an ideology that's now evil rather than people. And that even played out in the Polish election you referred to, Andrew. where the enemy was LGBT ideology. And I think that's very interesting. And I think that's a function of the fact that in many parts of the world, from Poland to Latin America to Ireland, where there was that extraordinary referendum, so many people know gay people now that it's harder to demonize them. So rather than demonizing the individuals, it's an ideological threat. The problem is, particularly when it's in evangelical hands, that ideological threat is vested in people, and it needs to be exorcised out of them. So in places like Brazil and Mexico, it leads to violence anyway, or Russia.
I do think, though, that your own story has, if not exactly, and perhaps I don't know all the details, but if not exactly a soft focus happy ending, it does it does have an appearance of joy about it. Do you think the book is celebratory in many ways, or do you think of it as being a sort of review only of negativity and pain?
No, I don't think that at all. I think the stories are really tough. And I think some of them are hard to read, but I do think there's a celebratory component of it. I should ask you whether you think it's celebratory, since I wrote it and you read it. But where I see the celebration, where I see cause for celebration, and you have noted this already, is in the courage and agency of the people I write about. Like the fact that the people I write about, and I write about them for this reason, have made the decision to be themselves and to live publicly as themselves, whatever the cost. And the cost is sometimes very high. I find that exercise of agency, if not celebratory, very moving and very powerful. Maybe celebratory too.
Yes, I would say celebratory. Here's another.
I'll take celebratory, I like it.
Beyond Russia, how do you see queer movements in relation to this global movement, a moment of authoritarianism and nativism?
I think I began to answer that a little bit already by saying that homophobia is used as a way of demonstrating that you're pro law and order, and that's Vladimir Putin, that's Jair Bolsonaro, very much so. That's Donald Trump in his assault on transgender rights. That's Viktor Orban. That's Andrzej Duda in Poland, recently re-elected. And I think we'll see more of it. It's General Sisi in Egypt. It's interestingly not Narendra Modi in India. He hasn't played that card, and we can speculate as to why.
Yeah.
He's a bachelor.
Yes. Well, we're very near to closing time. What are your hopes for the way that this book will perhaps change some of the situations it chronicles? I mean, I've said that there were things in it that I did find celebratory, and I deeply mean that, but there was also much of the book that's unbelievably heartbreaking. And I wonder whether, without asking you to sort of oversell the effect on world politics, but whether this kind of investigation has the potential to ameliorate some of the ills that that are afflicting all of us in relation to queer culture around the world.
I find it difficult to make such claims for a book. I hope it leads to greater understanding for those who read it. I hope it gets translated. I hope it gets distributed. I want people in Africa to read it, where it's very, very hard to get books moved around. I want people in Russia to read it in Russian. And we're talking to a Russian publisher. As you might imagine, it's not easy. But beyond that, I can't make any grand claims what I wanted to do politically. I don't believe I or my words have that power.
Well, I hope that they have at least some of that power, because they're powerful and beautiful words. We are sadly at the end of this conversation, which I would happily have sustained for another few hours. But I want to thank all of you who've come to listen tonight and to see us on our video projections. I'm sorry we didn't all meet in person as originally planned, but the world is not the world we planned on then. And I especially want to thank you, Mark, for your warmth, your generosity, your brilliance, and for your remarkable book. I hope many, many, many people will read it.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you for the time you've taken to read it and talk to me. And thank you for Far From the Tree, where it begins.